In this lecture, I want to introduce something called the circular flow model. It'll be our first model in this class, and it's a good one to begin with because it's based on one simple proposition that leads to all sorts of understandings about how the economy operates. So it's pretty straightforward. There's only a few pieces to kind of understand, but it also will give us a lot of understanding about economic fluctuations, the role of trade, the role of investment, the role of consumption. And so it's a good starting point. I know that there's a wide variation in people's backgrounds in economics in this class, so it's a good way to start thinking in a modeling sense without getting too technical or too involved in things on that. So we're going to start out with just this idea that every expenditure becomes income to someone else, okay, and that'll give us all sorts of understandings, I think. And then we're going to look at the central role of consumption and investment in the production of business cycles. And then we're going to look at this concept of aggregate demand, which is the total demand for goods and services. It's how much income and expenditures are going to cycle through this model. And then we'll complicate the model a little bit by looking at things that come into the model and things that go out of the model. These are known as leakages and injections. And then we'll use this to kind of understand why expansions happen in the economy, booms, and why recessions happen, downturns, or busts happen in the economy, where we go through these cycles of various sorts, mostly driven by aggregate demand. And then we'll introduce something called the multiplier, which is how much income and expenditures are created from an initial round of expenditures that might take place. So you walk into a store and spend some money, how much overall demand for goods and services is going to be created by that. And then finally, we'll look at the role of confidence in producing these cycles that are out there. Okay, so let's begin with a basic example. Okay, and for that, I want to think of us. Maybe you go into Tamichi Cycle, which is a local bike shop here, and you get yourself a tune and also have some parts replaced, and you spend about $200. Okay. Now, some of that $200 after you've paid the check is going to go towards parts that are produced outside of Gunnison. But some of it's going to go to the labor and the people who worked on the bike. And so maybe they have $100 that they take that hasn't leaked out of this whole system, and they go to City Market. And at City Market, they spend $100 on groceries. Now, some of that's going to go towards getting goods that aren't produced in Gunnison. Mangoes and papayas don't really grow here very well. And so the rest of it might go towards some to management, and some of it will go towards the checkers and the cashiers I'm sorry, the checkers and cashiers, and also to the stockers and people who are working in the store. And maybe they take $30 of this and they go to the Firebrand, which is a local restaurant, and they get lunch. Okay, they take a friend or two. And so what we've had already is, you see that initial $200 is supporting expenditures well above the first round. It's $330 just in these two extra rounds that have gone on. And this is kind of the principle that when money is spent in the economy, it doesn't just disappear, it then can be respent several times over as it's used for different things. Now, that might not always be the case because, as we saw, some of it went out of the county. It went to maybe corporate offices. Maybe it went towards places where they had to get parts or some of the groceries and those sorts of things that are there. But some of it will stay in, and that'll support more economic activity than that initial expenditure that's out there. So this is the basic idea of the circular flow model. And so let's do this a little bit more formally, right? And for that, let's think about separating the economy out into households at one end, or let me just spell that out. And let's just make this households here, one end of the spectrum. These are consuming units. They also provide labor resources. So household will both buy stuff, and it will also provide work for firms that are out there. And a firm is at the other end of the spectrum, okay? And they're producing units, and they also use wages to hire households. So they provide goods and services, but they also take provide wages to households and take labor resources from them. So we can see coming from households is consumption. Okay, so they'll get goods and services. So there'll be expenditures here of consumption, but they'll also get goods and services. And then coming from the firms over here, are wages to households. So going counterclockwise are expenditures, monetary expenditures of consumption and wages, but going clockwise, you have goods and services going to the households. And then you have labor services going to the firms. Okay, so this is our system that takes place here. And you can sort of think that suppose the household spends $100 consumption, then that's an expenditure by the household, but it's going to become income to the firm. And the firm's going to turn around and it's going to pay wages to households, and that is an expenditure for them, but it becomes income to the households. So if this were the end of the story, it would mean that that initial $100 spent would cycle to firms, then back to households, then back to firms, and on and on and on again. This would be, this would create an infinite amount of economic activity. We know that's not the case, so we're going to have to complicate the model a little bit. But for starters here, you can already see the important role that consumption plays in all of this. It makes up about 2/3 of the U.S. economy at any given time, sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less, but it's the driving force behind the overall demand for goods and services, what we sometimes term as aggregate demand. So with these expenditures going around and around on this will create aggregate demand. But again, this is too simple a picture here that we actually have some things that come out of this system and some things that go into this system. So let's first think about this whole thing a little bit differently as that $100 is coming back to the household. For that, I want to redraw this. Okay. So then what we get is, again, we're going to have households at this end. We're going to have firms at this end. I'm going to abbreviate. Give me a little more room here. And you get this $100 that's going out here and going from households to firms. That's consumption. I'll use C as an abbreviation on that. And then the $100 comes back around. And as it's coming to households, they have a decision to make. And one of the leakages out of this system is savings, or our savings. And in the US, we generally have a very low savings rate, net savings rate. Before the financial crisis, it dropped down to about 2.5 to 2.8%. It seldom gets above 10%, so we can sort of approximate and say, let's put a savings rate, the high end at 10% here. Now, what that means is that when that $100 goes from firms and goes back to households, what we're looking at here is immediately the households are going to save 10% of that, or $10. But that means another $90 is going to cycle around again. And then when it comes back to households, they're going to save $9 out of that. Okay? And then another $81 will start to circulate. Okay? So already we've seen in this simple example with only one leakage in the form of savings and a very little leakage because it's the US economy. Compare that to, say, the Chinese economy that has had savings rates as high as 48%, the Singaporean economy that has savings rates as high as 52% of their income. But even with this, we've seen that the initial $100 is supporting at this point, with only 2 rounds going around, $271. So we have a reinforcement mechanism taking place. Now, right away, this sort of highlights what can happen when there's a change in the patterns that people are spending and saving. That raising the savings rate, if we were to raise it up a little bit here, we'd see we wouldn't have $10 going out in the first round, but if we had it at that Chinese case where it's closer to 50%, we'd see $50 leaking out. And so there'd be a lot less generated through the circular flow. Now, don't think of this as a leakage as either good or bad at this point. Just think of it as something that structurally is happening in the economy and changes the amount of aggregate demand or the total demand that's flowing through this circular flow model that's out there. Okay. Now, what we've seen here is that this would keep going around and keep going around and generate income until it's all leaked out in this form of savings that are out there. Okay. We'll come back to that concept in a little bit, but that's only one of the leakages. That there are other leakages that come into play. Let me just list these. So we have here that among the leakages, one is savings, okay, but we also have taxes. So the government might step in here, okay, and as you're trying to buy stuff here, it might take a portion out, okay, and that goes in the form of savings, of taxes, excuse me. That's another type of leakage that's in here. And we also might have a third type of leakage, which is imports. Okay, imports are when you buy stuff from abroad, or if we're thinking about Gunnison County, buying stuff outside of Gunnison County. So if I go to the local bookstore and buy a book, that means it's probably going to cycle through another round. But if I get on Amazon and I purchase a book online, that is expenditures that are going to go outside the Gunnison economy that's out there. That's in the form of imports. Right now, our current president is very concerned about imports. So he's engaged in some trade protectionism and some things to try to decrease those imports, although over the last year they've actually expanded even more. So again, this is a leakage out of the system. Now, leakages decrease the amount of income and expenditures going through this circular flow. We'll say that when you add up all the income or all the expenditures, what you get is aggregate demand. We'll have another name later on called gross domestic product, but for now, just think of it as aggregate demand. And that is the total demand for goods and services. Okay. Now, the more leakages you have, the more that's going to flow out of this system, and the less aggregate demand you're going to have overall, the less demand for goods and services. So I like to think of this as a wash basin in which the water level represents aggregate demand. And so if you have a lot of leakages, that's like more stuff going through the drain and the water level drops and you have less aggregate demand. Okay, but there's also injections that come into the system. These are things that add to aggregate demand, and they're paired in some respect with the leakages. So opposite in savings is investment. And I want to put in quotations economic investment. This is really not about stocks and bonds, but instead it's about things that really create productive capabilities. So we often say that investment is about increasing the capital stock, the ability to produce goods and services that are out there. Think about a firm that's replacing its computers. That is an investment. They're replacing them with more efficient computers. And so that'll be an investment. You can think about a factory adding a new wing. You can think about a restaurant that buys a new oven. all of those are forms of economic investment. They're things that add to the overall ability to produce goods and services. Or you might open up a new hotel. That's a form of investment that's out there. Okay. We also have government spending. And this is an injection into this circular flow. So government spending in this case, think about it for goods and services. Don't think transfer programs, so don't think about Social Security and things like that. Instead, think about actual expenditure programs. After the financial crisis, the stimulus package actually built a bridge north over the Gunnison River, so north of town over the Gunnison River, and then it built a bridge over the Gunnison River west of town. And those were part of the stimulus package that were in there. They wanted something quick that could be put up and actually have an expenditure. Repaving Taylor Canyon was also part of that stimulus program. Also, they gave some aid to the states that then was used to rehire some school teachers and things like that. Those are all government expenditure programs. And the last injection is exports. And this is when people from outside our county or outside our country buy our goods and services. So the U.S. economy exports airplanes. Gunnison County, our big exports are hunting, fishing, skiing. When people come in and drop lots of cash on that stuff, that's an injection to the Gunnison economy. That's pretty significant. Now, you can see all of these are kind of paired, that savings and investment seem to be linked, government spending and taxes seem to be linked, and exports and imports seem to be linked. But they're not one for one. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean that when one goes up, the other goes up. In fact, when the 2008 recession hit, savings went up, but investment went down. In fact, that was one of the triggers for things. Individuals cut back on their consumption expenditures, and firms actually cut back on their investment. And as they cut back on their consumption, they raised their savings rate. Government spending and taxes are sometimes equated at the state level, but they're not equated at the federal government level, where we often run deficits, which are when we spend more than we take in taxes. They're separate operations. Sometimes we see taxes go up and government spending go down. Sometimes government spending go down, taxes go up. There's the linkage is they're certainly related to each other, but they're not one for one. And during the global financial crisis, most states actually cut their spending and raised taxes, while the federal government lowered taxes and increased their spending. So that was going on. And imports and exports are related. Countries with a lot of imports also usually have a lot of exports, but it's certainly not one-to-one. That the U.S. has, for a long period of time, imported a lot more than we've exported. And they don't go in one-to-one patterns on that. So now one of the things is that injections are like water coming through the faucet into that wash basin that we're looking at, and leakages are like water going through the drain. So if we have more injections than leakages, we see the water level rise. And if we have more leakages than injections, we see the water level drop. Now, if there's a lot of aggregate demand, that usually creates more jobs, we have more spending on goods and services, and we get a boom in the economy. When we have a lot of leakages, then we get a slowdown in the economy. Sometimes it'll be a recession. That's when actually we have negative growth that takes place, and we'll see unemployment rise and those sorts of things. Sometimes if we have, it's not sort of always that more aggregate demand is better, although we certainly want a decent amount of aggregate demand. But if we have too much of it, it could cause inflation. That's when you have too much demand for goods and services relative to what can be reasonably produced at that time. So just to recap here, before moving on, we started with this proposition that every expenditure becomes income. That leads to this core element that we create more expenditures than that initial one that takes place. We have this relationship between households and firms where going counterclockwise are the monetary flows, and going clockwise are the are the goods and services flows or labor services flows that are happening there. There are certain leakages out of this system: savings, taxes, and imports. These will decrease aggregate demand. And then there are certain injections into the system: investment, government spending, and exports. These will add to aggregate demand. Okay, so we can get recessions that start either at the household end or the firm end. So let me just scroll down a little bit here. So if we think about at the household level here, if the savings rate goes up suddenly and consumption goes down, that might trigger less aggregate demand. On the firm end, a big reason that you get recessions are investment declines. Okay, and so right now, consumption seems to be doing well. People are spending rather significantly right now. We don't have a very high savings rate. And I should pause and say that there's a tendency to think that because savings is a leakage that it's bad, but it's one of the most important things for the long-term health of the economy. But if we suddenly had a huge jump in savings this year, it would have a recessionary impact on the economy. But we haven't seen that. So far, consumption has been pretty strong. But we have seen a decline in investment. So right now, economists are worried about two things that might lead us into a recessionary area. One is this decline in investment, and also kind of a slowdown globally that then is going to factor into our imports and our exports that are out there, mostly on the export side. And both of those might have a recessionary impact on the U.S. economy. It does, in most cases, a recession that starts on the investment end is less serious than one that starts on the consumption end. Whoops. I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry. Guess I'll just start over. So households here and consumption, and then firms and investment here. When it starts at the investment end, it usually recovers quicker because what happens is firms will often cut back their investments because either they're scared about the future or they've overinvested in the past. And as soon as that slack is taken up, they'll start investing again. Whereas when it starts on the consumption end over here, one of the problems with that is that usually consumers won't start spending again until their wages start increasing. And that always seems to be a lagging effect in the US economy on that. So we get recessions that start out on the firm end that often look like this, where they come down quickly and then they go up rather quickly afterwards. On the consumption end, we get one that kind of goes down slower, but then it takes a long time for it to kind of recover on that. Okay. Indeed, the 2008 one was a consumption-driven one. What happened significantly, and this is from the work by two economists, Meehan and Sufi, okay, and they kind of found that those counties that had real declines in housing then saw a real increase in unemployment rates. And the mechanism for it was that people who thought they had had a house valued at a significant level suddenly felt poorer, and they cut back on the consumption expenditures, and then that led to unemployment. So you can see, starting out at the consumption end, reached firms, and then it came back to households in the form of unemployment. 1930s also was one in which there was a big decline in investment, but it was a huge decline in consumption that hit significantly on that. Okay, well, let's move on to talk about something called the multiplier. Okay. And the multiplier works this way. So going back to that households and going to firms, what the multiplier is in overall is just how much sort of bang for your buck do you get? How much do you create in overall aggregate demand from an initial expenditure that takes place? And for that, let's just think about a savings rate of 20%. And a household initially spends $100. Okay. Comes to the firms, and then when it comes back to the households here, then if they have a 20% savings rate, they're going to save $20. Okay, and then that's going to leave 80 to go around again, and as it comes back to households, then that's going to have another $16 that goes into savings, and then another $64 that's going to cycle around again. Okay. And we could continue doing this, but eventually all of this is going to leak out in the form of savings as it goes around and around and around. Now, this will eventually create a certain amount of money that we can kind of estimate, well, no, we can predict it with using a formula that is 1 over the savings rate. This is, I should mention that this is should call this the simple expenditure multiplier. Okay. Now, in this simple expenditure multiplier, we said that the savings rate was 20%, so 1 over 0.2, okay, 20%. And that gives us 5. So what that is saying is that if we spent $100, this would create $500 in aggregate demand or overall demand for goods and services from that. That's a pretty high multiplier. In the real world, they're somewhere between 1.1 and 1.6 or something along those lines. It depends on the structure of the economy and people's behavior, but somewhere in that range. That's partially because we only are using one leakage to come up with this in terms of just thinking about the savings rate. But you can see how this plays out, that a country like China, where the savings rate is more like 50%, so we do 1 over 0.5, gives us a multiplier of 2. Which means that initial expenditure will only create $200 of additional economic activity that's out there. This led the Chinese during the global financial crisis, when they did their stimulus package. We did tax cuts and government spending. They only did government spending because, well, you can see what would happen if they did a tax cut. Immediately 50% of it would leak out. You just don't get quite as much effect on that. Now, the multiplier comes from, and the formula comes from, the basic idea that this is an infinite series. What you're having is that with each round, a portion of percentage leaks out, a percentage leaks out, a percentage leaks out. So we can sort of figure out where this would tend towards. The easiest way for me to explain this is that if I said I was going to move between here and the wall half the distance each time, you know that I would never reach the wall because I'm always only moving halfway there, but I get closer and closer and closer to it. So I know the limit that I was tending towards. That's the same thing here. This number 5 or number 2 here is the result of an infinite series. We don't actually get there. We get really close to it. So you can see in our first 3 rounds here, we have $100 plus $80. That's $180. And then you add another $64, so that's $244. If you kept on doing it, kept on doing it, kept doing it, this would keep adding up and would get closer and closer to 500. It would never actually reach 500 on that. But that's the concept of the multiplier, that in how much of an additional expenditure, how much aggregate demand is added from an initial expenditure. It's also what they often use to sort of look at the impact of some firm in a locality's effect on the economy. So if we wanted to look at the impact, there was a study done just about, I think, 4 years ago on the economic impact of Western Colorado University, and they were looking at, not just the expenditures the university was making, but how much economic activity was actually supported by that. And they do studies like this all the time. Out there. They make sense if it's a very significant employer in the area, less sense if they're just taking a minor one that's out there. So let's sort of look at this, and then let's think about one last thing, which is this idea of how confidence plays in this. So that multiplier that I came up with before sounds nice and technical and nice and mechanical. But in actuality, the expenditures are always determined by people's behavior. And so 2 economists, George Akerlof and Robert Shiller, they're both Nobel laureates, came up with the idea of a confidence multiplier. And this basically argues that where that number, is from that infinite series is nice and straightforward. It's really dependent on how people's spending patterns are affected by particular levels of confidence in the economy. So the savings rate is determined by people's choices between consumption. I'm sorry, people's choice of consumption is determined by how nervous they are about the future or how confident they are about the future. And so if they're very confident, they're going to spend more and save less. Same thing if we're thinking about a firm deciding whether or not to invest. If they're very confident in the future, they're likely to invest a great deal. And that investment then is going to lead to more aggregate demand and probably even more investment. That's a concept that we sometimes call in economics the accelerator. It happens because when aggregate demand goes up, we often see investment go up. And then that leads to even more aggregate demand and it accelerates that way. That's how you get countries with big accelerator effects have big boom and bust cycles on that. But you can see where the decision to invest and the decision to consume is something that's based on the overall level of confidence in the economy. And so that can play a huge role in this overall system that we have. Okay, well, let's sort of close things out here and for now. And let me just go to overall here. Just go here. Did it wrong. So so as a sort of to summarize things, we have this model. It's based on the simple proposition: every expenditure becomes income to someone else. That supports a stream of flows that go through there. There are injections and leakages. Injections come into the system and add to aggregate demand. Leakages go out of the system and decrease aggregate demand. The balance between leakages and injections tells you the state of the economy to a certain extent, at least on the demand side. There's some supply side stuff we'll get into later. There is also this other concept called the multiplier, which is how much aggregate demand is created from an initial expenditure. And that's based on the structure of the economy and also on confidence. So we'll end there for right now, and we'll come back in a bit.